Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In disturbing news coming out of France, 8 journalists, including a senior Le Monde reporter, have been summoned, by the French domestic intelligence services. Now, this has provoked outcry from many circles, not just within France, but around the world, about media freedoms within that country. One of those cases is specifically the one surrounding the Le Monde reporter, Ariane Chamin. She's the one who broke that story about the senior Macron security aide, Alexandre Benalla, who had been filmed beating a protester while wearing a police helmet, that during last year's May Day protests. And obviously, then this has opened up a whole other Pandora's box of other revelations about Benalla himself, his connections to others. And there are, of course, other cases as well, not just the one surrounding the Le Monde reporter herself, but others, the 7 others as well at stake here. And the concerns, of course, are whether the French intelligence is essentially in some ways intimidating future such cases or future such revelations and blocking such things from coming out again if it is able to create an example out of these reporters at this time. Let's discuss that a bit further. We're joined now by Emmanuel Dupuy, who is the president of the Institute for European Perspective and Security. He's joining us now from the French capital. Also joining us from Paris is Vanessa Biard-Schaeffer, who is secretary of the Institute of General Semantics. Thank you both for joining us, Vanessa and Emmanuel. Vanessa, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of the fact that these 8 journalists have been summoned?
Well, first of all, I think it's very, very important to distinguish the journalists that have been called upon because of the Benalla story and the ones that have been called upon because of the Yemen story. I think it's very important to distinguish these two apart. My feeling is that there is a kind of battle within the establishment and the elite in France. And I'm a bit suspicious about what's going on right now.
Okay, Emmanuel, do you see it? Do you see it too? Do you think that there is something going on behind the scenes here in the French establishment?
Well, of course, I'm fully agreeing with my colleague saying that there's 2 cases. The cases concerning the investigation by the journalists from Disclose, mostly, who have interrogated the arms procurement deal with Saudi Arabia, and of course, these weapons leading to Yemen, and the case of Alexandre Benalla, which is not only about Alexandre Benalla, but the people who have been working with Alexandre Benalla. I have to mention the fact that the journalists have been, will be interrogated the 29th of May, Ariane Chamin, not only for the case of Benalla, but for having revealed the name of a special forces, a member of the special forces, of course, working with Benalla. But of course, we have to be very cautious about what is behind that. You were mentioning the fact that the government was willing, or the Secret Service, internal Secret Service, was willing to make a sort of model or to make a sort of example of that. But I see another aspects of things. And this leads us to the inquiry about the arms procurement. The Secret Service, DGSE, Internal Domestic Secret Service, wants to know precisely who gave the names and who gave the information. So it's not only a case of justice or a case of freedom of press, but it's a case of finding the facts and trying to know who internally gave the information to the journalists.
But Vanessa, why should that even be in at this time? If it is, as Emmanuel there said, and correctly, of course, if we're talking about the Yemen story, certainly it would be about why and who gave out that sort of information. But that's sort of the job of a journalist anyways, isn't it?
I think there's a message going on right there. The question is not so much about who said what to whom, but it's more about a political issue. Why is it that France is selling arms to the Yemen conflict? What I mean is that it's more a political debate whether or not France is in a good stand when it sells arms to foreign countries that are leading conflicts. So I think, to me, it's more like sending a message out loud saying, just forget about the Yemen and the arms deals right there, because we're going to look after you. And for the Benalla issue, it's a different story too, because Ariane Chemin is a very famous journalist in France, so I don't understand why she will be called upon by the French internal affairs like the GSE, when we all know that, yes, of course, she's leading inquiries, but the information most journalists get are not something they're looking for. It's something that is given to them. So to me, it's more like there's a big battle somewhere, and we don't know exactly who is in charge. But it looks like more like, we're sending you a message like, don't go too far or else you're going to have some troubles.
So basically then, Emmanuel, this can come down to, for one of the aspects of this entire issue, is that France doesn't want many of its policies, foreign policies, being questioned in this fashion. I mean, we know that there has been criticism of France's involvement in Libya. We know there's been a criticism of France's involvement in Mali, for example, as well, beyond just these arms sales that we've already mentioned in this case. So do you think that this is also in some ways a message to other reporters and other journalists based in France that, listen, do not question our foreign policies?
Well, it's not only about foreign policy. We have to have in mind that the criminalization of journalistic sources has started way before the Benalla case and, of course, the future convocation of Ariane Chemin. And by the way, Ariane Chemin is not only convocated, her boss is convocated as well, the president of the Directorate of Le Monde. So it's not only about the journalists, but also about the journals who are sustaining the journalists. We have to have in mind that from the beginning of the Emmanuel Macron's mandate, there has been various cases like that. For example, we have to assess the fact that during the last four months, 9 journalists have been convocated by domestic internal service, not only on Yemen, on the Yemen issue, but of course linked to a certain number of compromission of the national defense secrecy, which is, of course, a criminal case, 5 years of imprisonment and 75,000 euros. We also have to assess the fact that France is not in a very easy position. It was drafted by the European Parliament last of April, a whistleblower act, which France does not, or let's put it in a more diplomatic way, which France is reluctant to apply. In April 2015, there was a law on the secrecy of business, which of course allows a certain number of companies to say nothing is to be known about what the companies are doing. So it's not only about the question of arms or the question of our foreign policy, it's the way the government sees the secrecy of its activities, both domestically and both in an external concerning foreign policy as well.
So then, Vanessa, that's a disturbing sign, isn't it, for a country that prides itself on freedom and equality and democracy, isn't it?
Oh, really? There's something that's going on that makes me smile, because if you look at the ownership of Le Monde and the most newspapers and radio and TV media in France, you can see that the ownership is clearly in the side of the powerful. So how can you explain that this journalist got the ability and the freedom to publish what they published without some help and some will at the level of the ownership? So my question is, what is going on between these high capitalistic newspapers and Mr. Macron and the government right in place? I think this is a battle between two big groups, and it has nothing to do with the freedom of speech or freedom of inquiry in France or in the world. Look, Ariane Chemin is a good journalist, but nothing compared to the Assange case, which today is the one that's striking me like a very dangerous precedent and case. So.
But nevertheless, also, Vanessa, if I may interrupt you on the point, because I think that's an important point you made there, if you allow me. Because, even though, as you say, Vanessa, this may be a battle behind the scenes between people who have differing interests, but this battle will have an effect on freedom of press in the country, will it not?
Well, the freedom of press is just a concept. We know that you can't publish what you've been authorized to publish one way or another. If it's not directly, it's because of the financing or the way the media are financed. That's the reason why alternative media in France are going up and up. And that's also the reason why the newspapers don't sell much and they need large subsidies to continue on their work. If you look at the circulation numbers and the real people paying for this newspaper, it's so low that usually most of these newspapers should be closed down right now. The only way they can survive is because they got subsidies and because they have a capitalistic people who put lots of money in this newspaper to get influence and get the information they want information to get across. So speaking of the freedom of press, it's like it's very important because we have to keep it. But at the same time, look at the real facts and the real way the information is turning around, and you see that the real information doesn't get through.
Emmanuel, what are your thoughts on that? This is genuinely then more just political than anything else, and what kind of an effect do you believe this has then on freedom of speech, freedom of press, etc.?
Of course, it's political, and I think the link with the Assange case is very important. It is the first time you have the criminalization of a journalist, an inquiry of a journalist. What is accused of Julian Assange is precisely what the journals in 2010 made. The principal journals, you remember, The Guardian, Le Monde, by the way, did that. New York Times, they gathered the information from the WikiLeaks and they gave it to the public. So if Julian Assange must or will be or should be indicted under the Espionage Act, then of course all of the journalists who gave out the information should do it, should be on the same level. Because when the Americans are saying that Julian Assange is opposing or going against the First Amendment, then of course all the press is going on that way. And to make a parallel in France, it's the same thing. I think that it's a particularly difficult moment or momentum in which a certain number of information of powers, must they be political or economical, do not want a certain number of information to go throughout the press. And it's not only because there are new type of journalism, and because, of course, the new type of journalism go under the radar or are not linked to or cannot be judged in the same way as the more let's say conservative journalists. And this is why it's very important what is happening, and this is why I think it's not only a message which is given, but it's a sort of model, it's a sort of way of action that is very dangerous. And this is why 39 Société of Journalists said, enough is enough, let us do our job, you do your job, and we will do ours.
At the same time, Vanessa, the government has said that, listen, this is not an issue of freedom of press, and we've already spoken about how this likely is not about free press necessarily when it comes down to the actual issues. But nevertheless, the government says everybody must be held accountable when it comes to the law, even journalists. Is that a good defense publicly by the government?
Well, first off, I think for your spectators, it's very important to know that the regulation in France are not the ones you find in the Anglo-Saxon world. It's more restrictive, and we don't have the same regulation. At the same time, I understand that it's feasible, and I understand why our government or internal affairs would like to look into the search and work of journalists when it comes to very important issues and where the state is involved. So I'm not shocked. I'm not even shocked that they're requested to testify about their work. Look, as I said before, if there was very important information that the state didn't want to see getting through in the public space, it is easy to do so through the ownership of these journals. So the question is not, is it the freedom of speech attacked? It's the question is more like, who wants to make believe that these journalists are free and really willing to do this kind of search? My question is, we know that these newspapers don't get the information if they don't have the upper go into this kind of information. So for me, it's like a grand game, a grand theatrics. It's the play. I don't really believe that there's something important going on. I think they're crying out loud, oh, we're being attacked. But there's many issues, and there are a lot of stories that were never covered in France. And the question is, why was it that they never covered these kind of issues in the first place? So for me, it's a big game, it's a big play. I don't really take it seriously.
That's a good point, Emmanuel, because, you know, for example, if I may pick on things like Mali or Libya or even the Yellow Vests, I mean, there are a number of stories that come to mind just you know, off the top of my head when it comes to the way that necessarily media, not just within France, but even international media, sometimes cover French issues. A lot of that sort of stuff gets sidelined, doesn't it? Or it doesn't get contextualized properly. So, for example, if it's about the Yellow Vests, it's only really a talk about their violence sometimes. And not to say that every media is like that, but I'm generalizing, of course. Do you think that there is, to an extent, many bigger stories which are happening within France that get ignored?
Well, I think to pursue what my colleague said, first of all, the case of Benalla is very special. It's not about the security of France, by the way. And the convocation of Ariane Chemin is not about Alexandre Benalla, again, but about the divulgation of the name of a member of the Special Forces, Chokri Wakim. And this is how they present the story. It's not about Alexandre Benalla, but the fact that he said he didn't want his name to be revealed. But of course, that would be correct if he was working at that time for the Special Forces, which is not the case. We are in a very awkward position where the Secret Service are convocating a journalist who mentioned the fact that a former member of the Secret Service or Special Forces was working for on a private contract for a Russian oligarch. So it's not about national security. So that's putting aside the ambit of that story. Concerning your question, I happen to be a scholar. And there are bigger stories, of course, and I'm more frightened, of course, by the fact when the very prominent academic journal called Afrique Contemporaine has been censured by the fact that it was giving the possibility for an author to write about the upcoming difficulties of our French forces in Sahel. So I would not say that there is a censorship. I would not say that bigger stories are covered, but I would, of course, assess the fact that we are in a situation when all the elements which are giving a negative tone on our foreign policy, or, for example, giving the Libyan crisis, putting in emphasis our duality or our compromission or our, let's say, too biased position, of course, everyone and everything is put in perspective to show that the real story is not really what the government is giving publicly or serving publicly.
So then, Vanessa, this is, and I know I'm coming back to a point which I made earlier with you, Vanessa, and this again then goes back to, in some ways, the government trying to control the narrative, isn't it?
Well, I think the very important thing is that because they're confusing the Yemenite affair with the Benalla affair, it's like they're creating a confusion where we don't really see what's the real point. I think, to me, the Benalla thing is just a big joke, and I think I don't understand why they will just ask the journalist, why did you report that? Because it's the Benalla thing. It's just out of proportion, and it looks like we have a government that's using the public administration and the public forces to rectify or settle a conflict that it's just political. Again, it's like using a public administration for a private issue. And if we were in the years under De Gaulle or even Mitterrand, this kind of affair will have never been public. It's a point of ludicrousness and stupidity that almost I have a shame of my country, because we're going very low on the line of correctness and standing. I'm sorry if I'm a bit confused, but my point is that if we had been 20, 30 years ago, this type of affair would have never been public. The guy would have been dismissed, went private, and it will be done. So for me, there's something going on that is very, very dark and very, lack of common sense and lack of style, basically.
Okay. We'll leave there as a final word. Talk has gotten the best of us, but of course we appreciate both of your time inside Analysis. We thank Emmanuel and Vanessa. They're both speaking to us from the French capital. And now, viewers, as Vanessa and Emmanuel both pointed out, this issue is less, in fact, to do with just freedom of press necessarily, but is more to do with the political aspects of what is really going on behind the scenes here. These specific cases that we may talk about, be it arms deals, be it especially this Vanessa affair, these are all political issues at some level. Is the government trying to control the narrative? Is the government trying to control the kind of information that comes out about its policies? And then why are bigger stories within the country getting ignored as well? There's a lot at stake here, of course, because for the rest of the world, this is an issue of freedom of press, because I would still argue that this will still have an effect on freedom of the press, because an example is being made out of these journalists, and that will be at least the public message that will be received by many people, at least by the French public at large, I would imagine. So we'll keep a close eye on how that plays out. And of course, this ties into the Assange case, which we will now be discussing in our next segment. Stay tuned for that. Welcome back, viewers. As we've been speaking already in our first segment, there are concerns about free press around the world now, aren't there? But now we also go back to the Assange case, as our guest did in that first segment. Also, the U.S. Justice Department has now revealed 17 new criminal charges against the WikiLeaks founder, saying that he unlawfully published the names of classified sources and conspired with and assisted Chelsea Manning, who is a former Army intelligence analyst, in obtaining access to classified information, essentially espionage of sorts. So to discuss all of that a bit further and the implications of that, we're joined now by Ms. Anna Myers, who is with the executive director, I should say, at the Whistleblowing International Network. She's joining us now from Glasgow. And we're also joined by Patrick F. Walsh, who's Associate Professor of Intelligence and Security Studies at the Australian Graduate School of Policing and Security at Charles Sturt University. He's speaking to us now from Sydney. Patrick and Anna, thank you for joining us once again here in Scope. Anna, I'd like to start with you, if I may. Do you think that in some ways, as some people have argued, that the U.S. has miscalculated now that it's revealed that it does want to charge Assange with espionage? Does that mean that extradition will be that much harder to achieve?
I think it's going to be difficult to see or to really gauge that. I think obviously the US is a very powerful ally of the UK, but I think that in terms of what the public understanding of the implications of this and what the media's understanding of the implication of this has certainly grown since the last time we spoke, and there was a much narrower indictment that had been presented to the UK authorities around Assange. We've now opened it up. Or they have opened it up, and we can see that it really is going at the heart of some of what certainly American journalists and press freedom are all about. And we have now the Washington Post and the New York Times raising these issues and raising a red alert. So yes, I think the issues are on the table. There will be a lot more pressure politically from the outside not to extradite him because of the way that they fashioned this indictment. But there's also political pressure the other way, and we have a lot of cooperation between these countries at the political level.
Patrick, what do you make of that? Because as Anna there said, now the veil has been lifted, and the U.S. has come out very clearly asking for why it wants Assange back to be indicted on these charges. What kind of effect does this have?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think it was inevitable that they were going to increase the charges because I think there's a 60-day limit for that they can add charges under the UK extradition sort of legislation. So that was kind of going to come. Yeah, look, it's the Espionage Act of 1917 is pretty vague, and obviously, in many ways, it doesn't mention. In no ways does it mention journalism at all. It's really about espionage and sharing information, and more in a military sense from the First World War. But it is a concern for obviously constitutional rights of free speech and journalism doing their jobs. But as I've said before many times, I don't think obviously Assange is a journalist or a whistleblower. And he is probably a sort of different category, somewhere in the middle between what we would think of as journalists that are doing their legitimate, free press, educating the community about issues, as opposed to someone who I think is just a hacker. And I am concerned that this might set a precedence for other cases against journalists, which I think needs to be watched. But I'm not overly concerned about that. If you look at the amount of times the Espionage Act is being used over a century is only about 6 times. And if you look at the Snowden case, where a lot of even more damaging information than the Snowden stuff, the WikiLeaks stuff, was released in the New York Times, Washington Post, the journalists that dealt with that and distributed that material weren't charged under the Espionage Act at all. So I know that his supporters are worried about this and what it means for journalism more broadly, but I'm perhaps not as concerned. But
it's not just his supporters, though, is it, Patrick? Because it's a lot of journalists as well. I mean, even those who, I saw a lot of tweets today that, for example, they were separating the case in Sweden, for example, the rape case, or the alleged rape case at least, and saying that, he should be extradited to Sweden to face those charges and to face the full force of the law if indeed he is found guilty in that case. But then journalists in general, those who may not even agree with his tactics, still are concerned about the precedent that this would set for the rest of the community. What do you make of that, Patrick?
I accept that. I accept that general point of view, and I have sympathy for it. But I guess I'm getting back to what I just said. In the case of Snowden himself, I don't think this is going to be sort of the small sort of prick in the broader sort of threat to sort of freedom of speech or journalists being able to publish information that might be embarrassing or might be of security value to the country. Okay. I'm probably a little bit more skeptical about that link between the broader freedom of press and freedom of journalists doing their job in this particular case of Assange.
Okay, so let me add another voice to this conversation. We're not joined by Jeremy Bioletti, who is a barrister, and he's joining us now from Auckland in New Zealand. Jeremy, thank you for taking your time to join us here in Scope. Jeremy, as I'd put to our other guests as well before you came on, do you think that now the U.S. has come out and said it does want to indict or at least charge Assange with espionage, that makes extradition, even according to international law, or at the very least UK law, that much harder then?
I would agree with that. I would agree with that, and I was actually thinking the same thing today.
Mm-hmm. And then what does that then mean then at this time then, Jeremy, when it comes to international law?
The potential difficulty that it creates is that in order for there to be a successful extradition, there has to be a correspondence between American criminal law and UK criminal law. So the more complicated the charges, the more complicated that reciprocity review is.
Mm-hmm. And then, because I know you are an expert in human rights law as well, of course, Jeremy, do you think that this is a case of human rights as well? Because, a lot of people are putting it that way, that it's not just about Assange, the journalist, quote unquote, but this is also Assange's human rights, which are already at stake right now.
The journalism thing is a complete red herring.
Okay.
A complete and utter, it's actually completely irrelevant.
Mm-hmm. And why do you say that?
It's a fundamental issue of protection of people who reveal uncomfortable truths that have happened.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Anna, because you do work with whistleblowers, or you're part of the Whistleblowing International Network, I should say correctly, Anna, I'm sure that's a cause which is close to your heart, about the protection of those who do bring out, as Jeremy there said, uncomfortable truths. How does one do that? I know we've spoken about this in a previous conversation as well, but how does one do that in this case, and how does one do that especially at a time when now Assange has been going after so strongly by this very powerful government?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where I would have said earlier that I disagreed with Patrick in the sense that, and I would agree with your last speaker, that the issue of who's a journalist and who's not, who's a whistleblower and who's not, does sometimes really confuse it and is not the issue. I mean, definitely Assange is a publisher and he published. He worked with journalists and journalists worked with him. You know, you can kind of see this. We were talking earlier about the upward stream and the downward stream, and the media have relied on, worked with Assange, defining journalism. I think what we're talking about is who has the right to mediate between the issues that are being raised and the public knowing. So yes, there's lines around that, but I would say that whistleblowers tend to be the sources to journalists, but not always. They very much try to raise things internally and often suffer without ever having gone public. I think these issues around Assange raises really serious questions about who's allowed to mediate that, how much the government is allowed to take actions under the veil of secrecy. And what we're seeing is an attack more on those who are trying to get information out and less of a discussion and a focus, as I mentioned before, on the governments and the politicians who are very desperately trying to keep things secret. And in the national security field, I would absolutely agree. There are very sensitive issues and you have to walk very, very carefully. But we've gone through a period where American use of secrecy seems to far out, sort of outstep the boundaries of what would be considered necessary to keep the public safe. And that's what the battle we're seeing and having with whistleblowers and Julian Assange. And then we're doing it in the US and we're doing it under 1917, this Espionage Act, of which it was not intended. And we're seeing blurring of lines. It's very difficult in the US, but it will be difficult around the world because of that impact and the role the US plays in the world.
Indeed, and that's the point then, Patrick, you know, the example that the US is making for others around the world, that's a huge impact, isn't it, coming from the quote-unquote free world, and not just impact, but huge message, I should say, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I think I don't feel very comfortable. I think the Espionage Act is very unhelpful in this area, and you know, it's hard to reconcile that. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but it's obviously hard to reconcile that with broader constitutional rights, and that's where the friction is. But I think. Look, I don't know where the Trump administration is getting their advice on this. I personally think they should have stuck with the conspiracy charge, with the 5-year charge. And, you know, if they could prove, and I don't know if they have that information, but if they could prove that there was a Assange knowingly cavorted with Russian intelligence over the Democratic National Committee election leaks, that would be more aligned to the meaning of the Espionage Act at its current state. That could be something that could have been added. But it's really, it's an uncomfortable situation, I think. But I think, as I said before, I think this guy is slightly different from just a normal whistleblower, normal journalist. If we want to argue that he maybe is a journalist, I still have reservations about that. And that is that he also, as we said before, you know, not just not dump information on there, but also sources and methods, names of people that were helping the Americans in Iraq and Afghanistan. And these aren't exotic spies that you could say, well, you know, what was their morality and what was their interest. These were some people that were teachers, journalists from other countries, people that were reporting on human rights abuses in Iraq and Afghanistan as well. So, I mean, where are their rights in this as well? So we have rights for public speech, but also comes with that with responsibilities, particularly with secure intelligence information.
That's a very good point there, Jeremy, because, only with this sort of dumping of information, as Patrick there correctly put it, a lot of arguably innocent people's names were outed for supporting or at least helping the U.S. on the ground, be it in Iraq or elsewhere. What are your thoughts about that, A, and B, about the 1917 Espionage Act, and does that balance out with the U.S. First Amendment? What do you think about it?
Well, I think the core issue, or I shouldn't say the core issue, one of the core issues, perhaps on one side of the argument, is the right to privacy. Now, the issue from there is, are there two types of privacy, government privacy and citizens' privacy, or is there one total unit of privacy? So the case raises issues as to how to balance the right of privacy, even people who are committing criminal acts, whether they have a right to the privacy of their information. So the whole thing is a sort of an experiment in the digital age as to how we're going to function in the future. And if we go off too early at this point and condemn a certain type of behaviour, then we could find ourselves changing our minds in the future,
But that's a good point you made there, Jeremy, because I'm wondering, when you mentioned government privacy versus citizens' privacy, government is there to, at least in a democratic world, is there to serve the citizens, isn't it? And they've been elected by the citizens. So, I imagine that their privacy, not to say it shouldn't be respected at all, but in the sense of, as far as their governmental work goes, there should be, I don't know if this is the right word to use or not, but less limits on having more open access to that sort of those activities, even behind closed doors, versus that of a citizen. What are your thoughts on that, Jeremy?
My own view is that we should have to go through a process which happened, for instance, in East Germany, where the secret records of the government need to be, as a total, opened for inspection.
Okay. All right. So Anna, what are your thoughts on that? Because this sort of comes to the heart of the issue, isn't it? As Jeremy there well put it, government privacy versus citizens' privacy.
Well, I would distinguish. I think individuals have the human right to privacy, and I would agree with some of the characterization that you were trying to make, that governments are meant to be acting in the public interest and for the public good, and therefore we have to have openness and open governments. So there's been a push for governments to be much more open and to limit very much what they are keeping out of the public domain due to other public interests, not their own privacy as a government. You don't have a right to you're not a person, but the government business and being able to do that properly requires some sensitivity. We have been through a period, I think, where government overreach on not only confidentiality, but secrecy has been clearly causing problems. Therefore, we have journalists as well trying to get out information. We have whistleblowers becoming sort of this litmus test between the two and getting burned very much. And we have also, I think, journalists and whistleblowers' roles becoming blurred in that they're both being attacked. And it used to be much more that whistleblowers could go to journalists as a last resort. So I do think we've got the balance wrong. We get a case like Julian Assange, who is sort of taking the rap for everything. Again, you may not agree with all his methods, and you may see that there are very valid issues around the limits of what you can publish and the effect on those people. But those are the questions that are being done outside. At the moment, we have a case and an individual who may be extradited to the U.S. under a not fit for purpose law, which would have a big effect on journalism and First Amendment rights, and we're not getting the balance right. And we can see this being played out politically at a time where I think there's very few people speaking up for the right of the citizens to know, because there's a lot of fear as well. And so we want to be able to trust our governments to do it right. And we find out very often that they're not. So I think some recalibration is definitely necessary. But we also, I agree that we shouldn't jump the gun on this case. We may find if we do this wrong, it will have a very bad effect on human rights and openness and government accountability.
Okay, so Patrick, then this again, I'm going to put the same question to you that Jeremy had put. As far as government privacy versus citizens' privacy, what are your thoughts on that? Because it seems sometimes, or it seems like fact, really, Patrick, that the government, in fact, intrudes more on citizens' privacy than the other way around.
Well, I think that's unfortunately increasingly reality. In liberal democracies, where in the digital age. Sort of intelligence agencies have to go where people are communicating, and that inevitably invades, unfortunately, at times people's human rights and privacy. But I'm at the moment involved in a big research grant looking at the ethical and security and policy implications post-Snowden across the Five Eyes, and we're looking at these issues and how we can actually ethically risk manage for the intelligence community some of these issues around collection, so that we can give them some guidance on how you can actually have less of an impact for citizens. Yeah. But I mean, these are ongoing issues that aren't easily fixed, and I think certainly the intelligence community is because I know a lot of people in there. I work with still with a lot of people in there. Most people are very conscious of these laws, these powerful laws that are there. In most Five Eyes countries, there is a very good oversight of these laws and their impact on privacy. Do they get this right all the time? No. But I'm more confident that we can get this right. I'm actually like to see some more work done in the whistleblower space, so that we don't have to have this sort of clumsy sort of release of information that shouldn't be released, but stuff that can be going out that can also focus on where things can be improved and where the impact of privacy can be less. But I don't know how you fix that in terms of legislation or other policy processes. But I think we shouldn't be too down on the prospects that the intelligence communities in liberal democracies are this dark force that are constantly premeditatively impacting on human rights and privacy of citizens. I just don't subscribe to that view.
Jeremy, I wonder what your thoughts are on that latter. Do you think that a lot of us, including myself, mind you, are very pessimistic, have a very pessimistic outlook, I should say, on how many of these countries, especially as Patrick there put it, these liberal democracies and their intelligence services, how they act when it comes to citizens' privacy in general?
I mean, the whole problem with the intelligence community, for instance, in New Zealand, is that nobody can get to know anything about them other than the most basic information. And that's not good. Not good. So I think that the situation with Assange is just so wide that I think it's hard to comprehend how important the outcome of what happens to him will be regarded. I would have thought we kind of need to look a bit in the future and say, well, 40, 50 years' time, if we look back and look at what occurred there, would we be comfortable with it? And I wouldn't be. I'd be absolutely horrified. But that's just my personal view of his position.
Indeed, Jeremy, as a lawyer yourself, then I imagine you can at the very least appreciate the tough position that Assange's lawyers must now be finding themselves in. Ever since, of course, he had to leave the Ecuadorian ministry. What do you think that they're going through? What laws are they studying, and do you think that they have a strong case on their side to protect their client?
I really have no idea because I don't know too much about the new detail of just what's occurred. But
right,
just talking generically, I presume if they include the charge that was laid recently, Is there another 17 that's been laid, I think? So
yes, including espionage,
number of charges that would all have to be looked at in terms of the extradition legislation in the UK. So it's actually quite an involved thing to look at. So, the pressing issue for him is what's going to happen to him while all of this is sorted out, in terms of bail.
Indeed.
And they're saying, well, they'll say he'll run off back to another embassy, but, it's a very coercive thing to have happen.
Indeed.
To anybody.
Very much so. Well, we'll leave there as our final word, but of course, we appreciate all of your time, your insight and analysis. We thank Jeremy, Patrick, and Anna, who were speaking to us there and sharing their thoughts with us viewers about these latest charges that have now been brought by the United States against Julian Assange. You'll remember, of course, that he is WikiLeaks' founder. He has revealed many cables and a lot of information from around the world, specifically, of course, also about the U.S. role in wars in places like Iraq, especially, and many of the atrocities that have been carried out there. And now he has been charged in part with espionage as well, going back to an act of 1917. The concern is now about his First Amendment rights and about what kind of a precedent the U.S. is setting, not only for its own citizens, really, but for global journalists and global citizens, really, about their rights to free speech, et cetera, as well as how journalists will be able to ever do their work openly and find their sources, et cetera. There is then obviously concerns about whether international law can really even allow the UK to extradite Julian Assange in such a case to the United States. The U.S. may have overstepped at this point by revealing all these charges at this time publicly, but of course it had only a 60-day window to be able to do so, so its hands were tied to an extent as well. Does this mean Assange will be extradited to the U.S.? We'll have to, of course, wait and see in the coming days and months as well how that plays out. We'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi, and this has been Scope.